2023 was the year of books, or at the very least, the year of people arguing about them on the internet. And by people, I mean me. There's been a lot of discourse about whether people on the internet are actually reading or just posting pictures of books for the aesthetic, and when they are actually reading, are they reading the right books? And is the recent popularity of books on social media a good thing, or is it ruining the publishing industry? And I've noticed that whenever one of these questions comes up, there's usually two main groups having a go at each other on social media. The BookTok YA, fantasy, and/or romance readers in one corner, and the dark academia classic literature reader types in the other. I don't personally have an issue with either of these groups, and despite the title of this video, I actually love classic literature. I spent 5 years of my life and a significant amount of money to get not one but 2 literature degrees. In my opinion, it takes a certain commitment to being the quirkiest, most different guy at the function to try and argue that there's no value to reading the classics. So keep that in mind for the rest of this video, because I am about to criticize some people, not all, but some very loud people in the classics community who get quite a bit of silent support. More specifically, I'm talking about the type of person who not only believes that some books are better than all others simply by virtue of being considered classic, but who also seem to believe that reading exclusively or mostly classics makes them a more sophisticated reader and perhaps even a better person, which I'm not sure I agree with for a series of reasons, starting with the fact that the whole concept of a literary canon is not without its issues. An obvious one being that most classic literature writers look like this. Not exactly the most diverse bunch. But before I get ahead of myself, what exactly is a classic? According to Pan Macmillan, a subsidiary of Macmillan, one of the biggest publishing companies in the world, a classic novel is a book that has stood the test of time because it's so good. It has a gripping story, which is expertly crafted and brilliantly expressed. This article then goes on to list some other qualities that are found in classic novels, such as a certain level of complexity and depth, something that makes it subversive, and uniqueness, either because it's the first of its kind or the most influential in the genre. Based on my personal experience of talking to people about classic literature, I would also add a more simplified definition of what is a classic novel as an old famous book that is probably a little bit difficult to read. And in fact, if you search reading classics on Twitter right now, the majority of results that you get will be tweets from people who are hyping themselves up to read more classics in the new year, despite finding the genre a little bit difficult. And even some of the most popular book content creators seem to have a bit of a shyness around reading or reviewing classics if they haven't formally studied literature. Leonie from the channel The Book Leo, for example, is somebody whose content I really enjoy, and I was surprised to see a few months ago that she posted a video called Classic Books That Don't Require a Lit Degree to Enjoy, * not intimidating. And when I say that I was surprised, I'm referring to the fact that in this video she talks about feeling intimidated by some of the books considered classics because of the underlying feeling that if you don't have a literature degree, you might not get it. She talks about reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf and giving it a 2-star rating, but then doubting her own opinions because she felt that since so many people agree that this is such a good book, then it must mean that she missed something. I don't know Leonie personally, and I've definitely never spoken to her about Virginia Woolf, so it might well be the case that she didn't get it. That being said, it's also very possible that she just didn't like the book because she didn't like the book. Throughout university, I read several Virginia Woolf books, and I had the opportunity to go to seminars and discuss them with some of the most respected academics in the world, so I'm pretty confident that I got it, and I did enjoy a couple. I think Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando really stood out to me, but overall, I just don't think modernist literature is for me. It's just not my personal preference. But the issue with classics and the literary canon is that these books are so shrouded in prestige and expectation that people feel like they're not allowed to dislike them. The reputation of these books precedes them in such a way that if you don't like a classic novel, your first thought is not that the book is bad or that it may not be to your taste. Your brain immediately tells you that you're the problem because you are not able to take this opportunity to learn more about the world. Speaking of learning opportunities, I'm very excited to share that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Growing up, I was always the type of kid who had 100,000 hobbies, and my favorite thing was painting and drawing. But then as I got older, I needed to prioritize school and work and other activities, so I just kind of stopped doing it altogether. But one of my New Year's resolutions this year is to fully embrace my artistic side in all its facets, and Skillshare has been so helpful for this. You may know Skillshare as the place where people go for classes on film, graphic design, or to learn how to start a freelance career, but it's also fantastic for people who want to develop their hobbies. I've been taking this course on the basics of drawing, and I'm a little rusty, but luckily Skillshare offers curated learning paths where essentially they put together courses for you in order of complexity. So you get to start off where you are and then grow from there, which is so helpful. Skillshare is also offering a 1-month free trial to the first 500 people who click the link in my description. So if you've been waiting for a sign to start your learning journey in the new year, then this is it. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, people are intimidated by the classics, and I don't blame them. If Penguin tells me that there are 200 classics that they have helpfully printed out for me with pretty covers and I must buy them all, who am I to argue, right? A few days ago, I came across a video titled Classics of Literature, ellipses, or Are They? By a lovely man named Michael. Michael starts the video talking about the Penguin Classics book, a sort of catalog of all the Penguin classics ever made in the form of a coffee table type book. And he notes that at the back of the book, there is a chapter titled The Vaults, which presents a selection of Penguin classics that have gone out of print. In that chapter, Penguin explains the decision to take a classic out of print as follows.
These pages display some of the Penguin Classics titles that are no longer in print. Titles go out of print and drop off the list for the prosaic reason that low sales figures don't justify the cost of another print run. But each time one title falls away, it raises interesting questions. It implies that the way we remember literature is subject to change, that a classic may not always be a classic, that each title is required to maintain its position. It's like a battle to the death for classic literature.
And I love the way that Michael reads this out because it really stresses how comical the use of this flowery language is when the paragraph is really just saying, sure, literary quality and historical value is all good and well, but does the book sell? And don't get me wrong, I don't think it's outrageous for a publishing company to want a book to sell. Ultimately, publishing is a business like any other. Really goes to show that the whole system of classification of some books as classics is, to some extent, arbitrary. In which case, making it your entire personality to uncritically promote reading the classics over anything else is kind of silly, isn't it? In his video, Michael gives a few examples of books that used to be considered classics at one point in the past century, like The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope, which is one of the discontinued books in that Penguin Classics catalog. And another example he gives is The Purple Land by W.H. Hudson, which was at one point described by Jorge Luis Borges as the best example of gaucho literature. So presumably it has some historical value. And yet, not that many people read it anymore. There are other examples, but I think these two are enough to bring into question a little bit this idea that literary classics exist according to some sort of meritocracy system where the best and most deserving books organically rise to the surface. We seem to like to think that all books exist in the world equally, and that if they are good enough at capturing the zeitgeist or at expressing a universal enough experience, then they will inevitably achieve lasting fame. And I don't think that's true. Sure, there are a lot of classics that have maintained their status as such because they are loved and have been loved ever since they were published. I'm thinking about Shakespeare or Jane Austen. But there are also several books which, in my opinion, would quickly fall into obscurity if they weren't mandated reading in school or if that author's estate didn't invest a significant amount of energy into keeping them relevant. I'm not going to say which because I don't want to be bullied by men with dummy accounts. And that's not the point anyway. My point is that although there are literary works that have shaped the tastes and minds of generations because they are simply that good, the idea of a classics tradition is fabricated. National literatures and the literary canon didn't spontaneously manifest themselves. People made them up. According to Theo Diane, who is an academic in the comparative literature space, the concept of a national literature history was born out of a need to legitimize the existence of the nation state. In his book, The Routledge Concise History of World Literature, a classic for anybody who has studied comparative literature, he talks about the 19th and 20th century as an age of intense nationalism in which each nation strove to ground its legitimacy in its own literary antecedents. He thought that the increasing popularity of literature histories at this time was the logical cultural counterpart to the relentless process of political nation building or consolidation going on across Europe. In other words, if you want to declare your independence as a nation state, you have to demonstrate your uniqueness to your neighbors, most of which you probably have had territorial disputes with at some point or other in history. Some ways of demonstrating uniqueness is showing that you have a standard national language, or that you have a national cuisine, an anthem, a flag, and of course, national art. Even better if you can prove that all of these things have existed among the population for a very long time. So, putting together a canon of literary works that stretched back as far as possible provided this idea of antiquity that the newly formed nation states lacked. And some countries, like Italy for example, had been divided into smaller political units for centuries. Italy, for instance, was divided into principalities, each with its own dialect. So, in order for Italy as a unique political entity to succeed, the people in that territory needed a common cultural identity to unite them. So, having a canon of national literature was useful both domestically and internationally because it gave the people of that country a national identity to coalesce around and reinforce that identity to other nation states on the international stage. And in fact, we then begin to see that the more economically prosperous a country is, the more imperative it becomes for it to acquire the cultural capital to go with it, which is one of the reasons why, unsurprisingly, the majority of the books we consider classics are by white Europeans. And this brings me to the other issue with the classics, this inclusivity-exclusivity paradox. Theoretically, the literary canon is made up of works that successfully express universal truths about the human condition so beautifully that we still find them relatable centuries after they were first published. But in practice, for the longest time, it has been made up of works by old rich guys from the dominant cultures of the 19th and 20th centuries. Arguably, their thoughts and experiences are only representative of a small part of the human condition. In a recent essay for The Guardian, author Jeffrey Boache writes, "When you commit to the notion of the best that has been thought and said as conceived from one particular point of view, you automatically commit to whatever ideologies come in tow. Our curriculum is steeped in white supremacy, class, and gender bias, and many other blind spots created by societal norms. It's no accident that white straight men dominate the canon because people with those identities have historically enjoyed privileges denied to others. Add the fact that formal education was largely designed to appeal to the sons of the aspiring Victorian upper middle classes, and it's no wonder that there is a leaning towards a particular kind of classic." He also points out that any attempt to rectify the stale, pale, able-bodied male state of the curriculum is often met with outrage and seen as a form of war on classics. And it's interesting to me that this response oftentimes comes more so from the general public and politicians rather than the academics themselves, who supposedly are the people who know best. I remember being at uni and studying medieval Icelandic literature and Marvel movies together, or sonnets and hip-hop songs. But then you go on Twitter, and whenever somebody wants to make a connection between a pop culture reference and a classic literature novel, there's this outbreak of pure rage. And this rage goes hand in hand with a certain snobbery that I see from people who identify as classics readers and who feel that anyone who hasn't yet or chooses not to read those books is not entitled to call themselves a reader, which is very, very silly. And I'm not one of those people who tries to argue that all books are equal, because they're not. But personally, if I come across a book that I feel is infinitely superior to everything else I've seen out there, my first instinct is to recommend it to as many people as possible and encourage them to read it. Not to moan about how few people have actually read it and how lonely it is to be one of the last ever people to appreciate real literature. Because this is a lot of what I see from the so-called classics readers on the internet right now. A tendency to go on Twitter and complain about how everybody on BookTok is stupid and no one reads the classics anymore, which is observably not true. One of the most popular types of content on BookTube, for example, are videos recommending accessible classics or giving tips on how to get into reading classics. And I think the popularity of this type of video shows that there are a lot of people out there who are really curious, specifically people who maybe grew up in environments where these types of books weren't being read, or no books were being read at all. And that is one of the biggest flaws that this type of self-proclaimed real reader has. They assume that everyone has equal access to literature and literacy, when this is not the case at all. Every single person across the various online reading communities is at a point on their reading journey that is specific to them. Going around and pointing to real readers and not real readers based on what somebody is currently reading is such an empty exercise. It also seems to me that the sentiment behind this criticism is not always a desire to encourage people to read better books, but more so type of virtue signaling. The nameless Twitter user screaming into the void about how no one reads quality books anymore is actually trying to draw attention to the fact that they, nameless Twitter user, do read those books and should be acknowledged as special for doing so. Nameless Twitter user doesn't actually want people to read more quality books, because if they did so, then nameless Twitter user wouldn't be so special anymore. And I know that this sounds like a huge generalization, so let's look at some examples. A few weeks ago, this ridiculous tweet went viral. It's now embarrassing to read Kafka, Camus, Dostoevsky, or even eat pomegranates. These activities must now be avoided at all costs or done in secret. This is in reference to the fact that there is a whole new group of people, read women, who are reading these books and discussing them on social media, primarily on TikTok. So immediately this triggers the natural law according to which if something is popular with young women, it's now cringe. As explained in this person's further tweet, what is consumed by cringe has to become cringe until it's depleted by all merit. Then it becomes worthwhile again. Now, based on this person's other tweets and their choice to tweet anonymously, I'm assuming that all of these non sequiturs are mostly meant to function as outrage bait. But then the other day, another tweet went viral in which a bunch of people are making fun of this woman who made a TikTok getting ready to read the Brothers Karamazov. And one of the top comments on this was, "We need an aesthetic that's the exact opposite of this. Reading the great works whenever, wherever, total disregard for vibes. Information intake by any means necessary." And a bunch of people pointed out that what this person is talking about is also a vibe. The absence of an aesthetic is an aesthetic in itself, etc., etc. But I think that both these examples are representative of a type of person that I find very interesting. A person who perceives and wants to present themselves as intellectual, but can only do so by pointing out other people who are not intellectual. And I would say they take it a bit further than that. They don't just want to portray themselves as intellectuals, but also control what it means to be an intellectual. Because once people interact with the literature that they themselves prescribe, then they reveal that they don't want just to dictate what to read, but how to read it. But even then, they want to reserve the right to make the thing that was aspirational, per their wishes, cringe once they feel like their uniqueness is being threatened. There are, of course, a lot of lovely and welcoming people in the classics community online, but I still feel like this video is ending on a bit of a depressing note, so here's a video of my dog being adorable. Much better, isn't it? Thank you so much for watching. Remember to check out the link in the description for a 1-month free trial with Skillshare, and I will see you next time.